Welcome back to the Application Lifecycle Development course. In this lesson, we're going to set up our project. Now in our case, we've decided that we're going to use Git as our source control of choice and Azure DevOps as our cloud-based command center for our project. So let's get started by going to visualstudio.com. Now this is where you get started with Azure DevOps, this third choice right here. And you click Get Started for free. Now, in my case, I already have this set up. So iamtimcorey.visualstudio.com is my personal Azure DevOps. Now, this is free for up to 5 users as long as your organization does less than $1 million per year in, I believe, revenue. So this is free. If you have Visual Studio Enterprise, you also have a license. So that's an extra license. So you have 6 licenses instead of 5. So with the free account, which almost everyone can use, you get 5 users that can collaborate. In our case, we only need 1. But that's okay. Even with 1 person, this is very, very valuable. So my organization over here is I am Tim Corey. I could add another organization inside this account and have multiple, but in my case, I just need 1. And I come over here on the right to Create Project. And it's going to ask me a few different things. The first thing it asks for is a project name. I like to keep my project names without spaces just to be on the safe side of things. Let's call this the Lifecycle Project. The Application Lifecycle Project for the corresponding course at iamtimcorey.com. Okay, so project name is important. Description you can change at any point, so feel free to put a starter description in there if you don't really know how to describe your project just yet. But if you want to be a little more clear, you can. This really is just for you so that you know your projects apart. Now, please don't call your projects Project 1, Project 2, Project 3. That would be a problem. But if you have projects that are similar, this is really helpful for describing what each project does or is supposed to do. Now, my repository or my Azure DevOps is set up so that I don't have any public repositories. So this is actually disabled for me, and that's my choice. So I have chosen not to even allow myself to make public projects. So public is disabled, but private is chosen. If you want, you can go into the organizational policies, just click here, and it will allow you to turn that on to allow public repositories. Now, advanced, this is something you want to look at. First of all, version control. Now, this is something great, I think. This is from Microsoft, and Microsoft has their own source control. It's called Team Foundation Version Control. But don't use it. Unless you have an existing project that is currently using this, you want to stay away from it because it's not an industry standard. It's different in how it works, and I think Git has come a long way to go beyond what the Team Foundation Version Control allows. So Git is an industry standard. It's where a lot of companies use, most companies that use source control, at least modern ones. If you have legacy software, which a lot of companies do, then it may be in a legacy source control system as well. But for new projects, typically this is the way companies go. So leave it at the default. But the reason I think this is awesome is because Microsoft, even though this is theirs, they default you to really the better one, which is Git. Now, work item process. If you're going to use this, and if you have a preference, this is where you choose it. Do you do Agile? Do you do CMMI? Or do you do Scrum? By default, I leave it where it's at. So really, you didn't have to look at this, but I wanted you to because I want you to see that's where Git gets set up as a source control of choice. So now we have our lifecycle project set up. We just hit Create. And we give it a couple minutes, and it's going to create this project for me. and it's going to take you right into that project. And there we go. Now our project is set up. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to kind of explain the different pieces we have here. So right now it says, hey, you just started, so where do you want to start? And you can choose any of these, and all it's going to do is take you to one of these sections over here. Or you can manage which services you have. We'll get to that in a minute. Over here on the right is stats, which are blank for right now because there's no stats, but we'll see that in the future, and also who is a part of this repository. Again, for now, it's just me, but I could come up here and invite someone to this repository. Inviting them will use one of my 5 licenses unless they come with Visual Studio Enterprise, in which case they'll use their license. All right, so let's just start at boards just so it takes us somewhere. Okay, so this is our board, which we'll get to in a little while, but this is where we use that agile process for creating user stories and then backlogs and sprints and all the rest. Then we have our repository. This is where our code will live. So you see files, commits, pushes, branches, tags, and pull requests. If you don't know all these words, what they mean, don't worry, we'll get to them. Then we have our pipeline, where we have build, release, library, and task group, and deployment group. This is where when we upload or commit our source code to the Azure DevOps, we can kick off some processes that will build our code for us, and then if we want to, deploy it to different locations. We will be using this quite a bit in this course. We're not going to get to test plans or artifacts in this course. Test plans are for setting up a little more advanced testing scenarios. Is beyond unit testing, but into other areas and having a team for testers. And then artifacts, this is where you would create different feeds for things like your own private NuGet packages, NPM packages, and so on. And again, we won't get into that in this course, but probably in a future course we'll cover this quite a bit. All right, back to the overview. Let's go ahead and look at, we have dashboards, we don't have set up yet. We have a wiki, which we don't have set up yet. And I don't think you will for this course, but what you can do with the wiki is you can create a whole wiki about your project. It's interesting to do, and you can actually publish code as a wiki, which will help you keep your code and your documentation close together. But again, kind of out of the scope of this course. This course is all about getting our code into a repository, working with it as a team, and then moving it through the process into production. So the last thing I want to do before we move on is I want to go to this Manage Your Services, which also will take us right down here. If you notice the lower left-hand corner, it says Project Settings. So let's actually click the Project Settings instead. And this is where all of our settings are for this project. Notice there's a description. And I guess we can actually change our project name too. That's interesting. That didn't used to be. So our process cannot change. So if we want to move from Agile to Scrum, I believe what we need to do is actually create a new project. But down here at the very bottom, you'll notice that we have boards, repos, pipelines, artifacts, and test plans. Notice that lines up with these 5 options over here. And they all have the on indicator. But we're not going to use artifacts or test plans. So I'm going to remove the 2 of them. Now this message says basically that we're hiding them. We're not actually removing them. And so if there were things in there, they'll be there if we re-show them. So this is more of a visual cleanup than it is deleting things. And they'll go away once we get out of here. There you go. This is our team and who's on it, which right now it's just me. There we go. And this is who I am, and you can dive into my information, or you can remove me from the team. And there's a whole bunch of options here about security, who can do what, and this is more useful if you get into a larger team environment where you want to restrict permissions on certain people to only do certain things. And you can explore down through the rest of these. I'm not going to go through every setting. There's a few I'll pull out that are kind of helpful. One is service hooks. So service hooks allows you to trigger something when something happens. Okay? So for example, you can create triggers off of Zapier. So it supports all events and it sends a notification. So it can trigger events on Zapier. We can also, on the other end, we can have things triggered in here based upon Zaps. So there's also Trello, Slack. You can put a message in your Slack channel that says the build is done. All right? So that's can be very interesting. I think the rest of these things, we can configure our boards and how that's what areas are there and how the iterations look like. That can be useful. But for now, I think that's all the configuration we need to do in this section. So let's go back to our repo and go to Files. Now there's nothing here yet. We just set up our command center, our Azure DevOps project. So the first thing I want to do is I could do a clone, or I could pull or create an empty project, but I really want to start off with a README and a gitignore file. So a README allows me to describe what this project is, how to install it, how to configure it, how to work with it, who created it, all this kind of good stuff about a project. Really helpful stuff. And if you look at almost any GitHub project, you'll see a README because it describes to the world, this is what it is. Now for these private projects, this describes to your team what this is. So I'm going to start with this README. I'm going to say that the initial commit to my repository is going to create a README file. That way I have it, and it creates a little template for me to then just fill in the blanks of the areas that I want to cover. The gitignore file is really important because that will prevent certain files from getting uploaded via Git. Now we'll cover this more in the future, but for right now, there are certain files you don't want in your repository. For example, NuGet packages. We don't want them in our repository because NuGet will restore packages on build. So storing all those heavy files and those big files, we don't need to do it. We also don't need to store anything that gets created in the build process. For example, anything in the bin directory. So bin debug and bin release and all those files, we don't need those and don't want those in our repository. And finally, we don't want anything that would be a security issue. For example, passwords. We don't want those in our repository. So we'll try and filter that stuff out and make sure the git ignore and initialize. And there we go. So now our files list has our root project, and then it has the files that are in there, the git ignore and the readme. Let's click on them. Here's the git ignore. Notice it's going to ignore the .suo, the .user. These are all things it's ignoring because there's our .vs because of the fact that it's either Visual Studio specific or it is in general, these are things we don't want. So you can look down through here and make sure that everything's configured the way you want it to, but it really should be because this is based upon working with Visual Studio. And there's a lot here. Essentially, if it's in this list, it's going to be ignored when we want to commit files. So if you make a change to a file in the doc project folder /help/star.hxt, you won't see that reflected in your history of changes in Git. Okay, so this is our list. It's kind of long, but that's why we have these templates. It makes it easy for us. If you want to ignore something else, you can just add it to the list. Okay, our README. And this is really cool. So this README is in what's called Markdown format. That's the .md extension. And Markdown, let's look at the contents. It's kind of like a shorthand HTML, but it's just basically a text file. We use things like pound to indicate our H1, H2, H3 level. So pound is an H1 equivalent. So it creates that header 1. And then we can just start writing things out. We can number things, and we can use dash for the bullet points, and it gets converted into this nice HTML style layout. So it's easy to write. It's not complicated. It's not overly full like HTML is. So it's easy to read even in just text format. And yet if you have a tool that actually reads Markdown, it looks like this. Now this is our sample README that it created for us. It has an introduction, a getting started, a build and test, and a contribute. And these are suggested sections. You can get rid of anything you don't want. You can change things, and we probably will in the near future. But for now, we're going to leave it just as it is. However, this is one of the features I want to show off about DevOps. If I wanted to come in here and say edit, I can make a change to this README just by hitting edit. And now I can start making changes. For example, I'm not really going to want this contribute section. This is just for me. I'm not going to create a contribute section yet until git ignore files. And then remove contribute section for now. That's our second commit. Pretty simple stuff so far, but we're going to get a little more complicated in a bit. We don't have anything for pushes, branches, tags, or pull requests yet. That's okay. Now, let's go back to our overview. And here, this is a little plain right now. What I want to do is make it a little more useful. So let's hit this pencil icon here. And I want to add a README file for my lifecycle project. And there we go. There's our README file. I hit save. Now, you're going to get this message at first where it says we can't find the readme.md file. Don't panic. It found it. Hit refresh. There we go. There's the README. So now this README is on the summary page, and this is where every person comes in initially. So they'll see this and see how to get started, how to build and test, and anything else you want to provide them with. This is where we can link to other documentation as well. Now we could have, if we wanted to, link to a wiki. So if you have a full-fledged wiki for this project, you can link to that instead. Okay, we're not going to set up dashboards yet, but we probably will in the future. A dashboard is where you can put different pieces on there if you want to kind of get an overview of how your project's going. But the reality is, especially for a single person or a small team project, it's not terribly helpful because you know how it's going because you're the one doing the work. And you have other ways of getting lists of information like, what do I do next? So some of these things aren't necessarily necessary or needed until you get to a larger size or a larger scale. So I'm going to try and keep you on the path of I'm a single developer or I'm a small team. However, I will point out areas where as your team grows, it might be useful. And dashboards is one of those areas. Okay, so at this point, our project is set up in Azure DevOps. We have our lifecycle project set up. If we come back over here, we can see lifecycle project, what it is, and what it has access to. Notice this one has all 5. This one has just the 3, because that's all we need. So if you click on this, you go right into, again, that summary page, and you can go from there into your code or your boards. So there's our code. So that's it for this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to dive into Git, how Git works, and then how to start working with Azure DevOps and our code in this repository.